Our nonprofit is working to create more structure and engagement with our board through the adoption of committees. We've been debating about the types of committees that are board committees and those that are more operational. So my question is twofold. Should some committees be board-driven and others staff-driven? What types of committees might fall under each category?
Great question. I think that you want to keep in mind the role of the committee. What is the committee's charter and role? And so board committees are oftentimes focused on board-related, fiduciary governance type stuff. So that can be everything from an audit committee or finance committee that's looking at what systems you have in place and just sort of overseeing finance, being a support with investments if that takes place, and the finance committee kind of overseeing your investment strategies. So those types of things that you would say this is really baked into kind of board governance and fiduciary tend to be those types of committees. And then I always say, what is operational? What are the things kind of the day-to-day, like human resources? You'll hear groups say, oh, we have a human resources committee. And I'm a big believer. I don't actually think there should be a role for the board on a human resources committee. But if you are going to have that committee and you want perhaps some expertise on your board on that committee, it could be a staff run committee because it's a very operational type committee. And then you could invite a board member not, wearing more of a supportive hat based on their expertise onto that committee to help you think through things if you absolutely feel you need an HR committee. But again, you're hearing my reluctance with that committee. I also think you see this come up with events, right? Andy, you and I have seen it. Organizations have their events or their gala committees. And so you have to think about what, again, is the role of this committee. If the charge is to get board members involved in fundraising for the event, then perhaps it is a board-led committee. If it is to execute, all the details and logistics of an event, like selecting the color of your napkins, which, yes, I've heard of boards doing this on these types of committees, then no, I don't think, again, that should be a board-led committee. That's absolutely a staff-led committee. And again, you can invite board members in, but being really clear of what their role is. They're more there to support staff in executing it, and it's less about that it is really a formal board committee type thing that you would report back on at a board meeting about the board committee. So I just always say, is it operations? Is it, governance? And that is a litmus test. And then making sure you have a charter that kind of outlines that and walks through with people, here's what the role of that committee is. Here's what this committee's reporting responsibilities are back to the board. And that's what a committee of the board should be doing, right? Reporting back on their work. So much of this, I think, also depends on the size of the organization. So obviously, if you're a real small grassroots organization, you're probably going to have a lot more of these types of things, or you'll have board members assigned. Maybe it's not even a committee. It's just like, hey, you're in charge of X for operations because you're teeny tiny and you don't really have the staff. But if you're larger and you've got any kind of staff, generally staff is taking on the operations committees. Did that, Andy, I sometimes feel like I live and breathe this so much that I don't know if I wonder, is there more to it? Do you think, does that make sense? Do you think, or do you think I'm too in the weeds on this?
No, I think that makes sense to me. I think that, like as you were talking, I was trying to convince myself of what you were saying. like you clearly know a lot about this particular topic, and so I was trying to learn as you were talking, but I don't think I got very far. And here's why. I don't think boards should drive, because the question said what should be board driven committees. I don't think the board should drive anything. So the last thing that I would want as a staff member is a board kind of going off and doing their own thing and coming back to the staff with, this is what we decided. And maybe it's different for small organizations. Again, like a lot of my experiences with much larger organizations, which have very different kinds of boards. But I see that a board committee sort of left to its own devices is either going to start making trouble. They're going to start coming up with projects to do that don't have anything to do with anything else, or they're just going to fade away and they're not going to be useful at all. So what there needs to be, I'd say, like a really strong communication between whoever the staff member is that's responsible for the actions of that board and whoever's in charge of running the board have to have like a constant conversation about every topic and what they're going to talk about, so that the board like knows what's expected of them, because a lot of times they don't, and that the staff member isn't surprised by like crazy things the board just made up, right? So, even from a finance perspective, like if you have a finance committee and the finance committee is pretty regimented, there isn't a lot of opportunity for a finance committee to go and just pick up crazy ideas and run with them. But at the same time, you still want the staff member that's responsible for the finance committee to be sort of driving the conversation about, here's the things we need to talk about. We need to discuss this at this cadence, and we need to make sure that we're ready for this thing at this time. Because like for the finance committee specifically, you've got activities that need to happen on a particular schedule. For example, you need to approve the budget before the fiscal year starts. Like that has to happen first. And a lot of times like the strategic plan needs to be created before the budget gets created, because that's supposed to inform the budget. So if the board is in charge of it, they may not realize that there are these timing things that they need to be responsible for. So it's really up to a staff member to say, here's your agenda. Is there anything else you think we need to talk about, right? And add their things to the agenda as you go. But yeah, so I guess, I'm probably saying the exact same thing you're saying, but I feel like if the question is which committees should the board drive, Andy's answer is none of them.
And maybe this is a nuance. I'm glad you brought that up. So one of my assumptions with all of this is there should be a staff member involved in every committee. And yes, that can be, and sometimes you find on small organizations, it may be the executive director on every committee, and that can be a lot of time and work. But because you need that person who's kind of got the master lens of what's going on, and the way I distinguish, and that person's probably going to say, yes, board, remember, it's this time of year, X needs to happen. But I think with that, it's also about what does the board need to be like looking, what are the things the board is looking to measure and sort of have that more oversight from do we have the right systems in place financially? What is our investment performance? It doesn't mean an executive director or the finance director or whoever's on the team isn't doing that too. It's sort of that extra, I think, layer of just oversight and making sure the organization is in check that typically falls with boards. So I always just use the test of, is this something that needs to go back to the board, a policy, like we're going to create this kind of policy for board governance, or a board, I don't know, like a whistleblower policy. Well, great, like probably something that should at least be approved by the board. And so maybe the committee's working on it. So I always think, is it something that the board's going to need to approve, or yeah, like something where the board's exercising their kind of oversight and fiduciary roles. So I think, I don't know if that helps for the person who asked this question, but I think thinking about it with what Andy also said, of that doesn't mean staff just steps back and the board just meets without the staff. Like that scares me. And it's, you can see an organization go really like start to fall apart when that happens, because boards don't understand the timing, what needs to be done when, and it's no matter what I've worked with boards on, like no board have I ever found has that cadence down, no matter how good a board they are, like to remember that, right? So the staff is always like this support and sometimes thought partner at that committee level. So is that, you think we're on the same, I think we're on the same page, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd say for an organization that doesn't have committees, like committees are really important just in general. So if you're small and your board feels overwhelmed with the volume of stuff that you're throwing at them, but committees are a really good way to sort of segregate it into spaces where you can have longer conversations about things. Like, because the board wants to, my opinion, board meetings should be sort of short and to the point, and all the business should be sort of transacted quickly so that if there's stuff to talk about, that the board has time to do that, rather than we're just going to have an hour and we're going to just say aye to a bunch of stuff and be done. So like if you can get the finance committee, for example, if you can get the finance committee to delve into the financials a lot and like understand like where we are with the budget to actual and what our cash flow position looks like and all of those technical details, and then have them really comfortable with it. So you've spent an entire hour in that committee talking about financial stuff. So when you get to the board meeting, the treasurer can then present the financials, which is always the better way to do it rather than to have a staff member do it. So the treasurer is doing it and can answer any questions because they sort of deeply understand it now because they've spent the time in the committee meeting understanding it. So I think committees are super important. I think we both agree. We just don't want them to go rogue. That's not good for anybody.
No.
Nonprofit governance.
Nonprofit answers.
Nonprofit board. Nonprofit management.
Nonprofit marketing. Nonprofit resources.
Welcome to Nonprofit Everything, the podcast where hosts Andy Schuricht and Stacy Wedding answer your questions about all things nonprofit.
Welcome to another episode of Nonprofit Everything. I'm Andy Schuricht. I'm here with Stacy Wedding, and we're here to answer all kinds of nonprofit questions. So the way it works is you go to the Nonprofit Everything webpage, or you reach out to us through one of the social channels where we are almost always called @Nonprofit Everything. And you can send us questions, and Stacy and I will do our best to answer them. Or if they're too complicated or we just don't feel like it, we'll bring in a guest expert. And you can also suggest guest experts too. So we do have the ability for folks that feel like they're experts to register on the Nonprofit Everything website, right? To say like, I'm an expert in this area. And then if we get a question that's in their area of expertise, we'll reach out to them. But to be honest, a lot of them are selling books and consulting services, and that seems really boring. So if you have somebody that you want us to talk to, we are shameless. We will call anyone and get them here and ask them complicated questions about nonprofit stuff. We love doing that.
Well, and it could be you too, right? Like, so that's the other thing. It doesn't, if you are an expert in a certain area or feel like a lot of people come to you as a resource for things, like we would love to have you. So don't be shy and humble. We want you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Stacy and I have clearly just decided that we're experts, which is why we did this. Like, we just like, we'll just do it and people will listen, and they do. But yeah, it's good to have alternative opinions every once in a while, since Stacy and I agree on like 90% of stuff, I'd say. Maybe we need to be more antagonistic. Maybe we need to take like differing positions on things just for the sake of arguing. What do you think?
Well, I think you might do better at that than I would. I was never good in debate, and conflict scares me. So I think I would just melt down. But I'm happy to do it with you. I feel like you could come back much quicker. I'd just be like frozen, like, oh, like I could even say in certain episodes, Andy, like when you're like, well, a little bit of a difference of opinion, I start to break out a little bit in a sweat, like, oh gosh, like, did I say something stupid or was I wrong? But I have to like center myself and say, no, Stacy, like everyone can have multiple opinions about this. So
It's okay. well, that sounds like a challenge now. So,
oh dear. I don't need any more stress in my life, Andy. We're not doing that.
All right. I'll be nice.
Andy, here's one for you. We submitted a federal grant through a state agency, and they are telling us that some of our expenses are not allowable, even though they clearly are, according to the Code of Federal Regulations and the Notice of Funding Opportunity. Do we push back and risk not getting the grant at all, or just let it slide?
Oh, this question hurts my soul. So this is not at all uncommon, and luckily, there are a few things you can do about it. So I'll just maybe some more context for folks that aren't like do a lot of federal grant stuff, because it might be confusing. So what happens with a federal grant a lot of the time, it's not every time, but a lot of the time, a or a federal agency will say, okay, Congress has given us money and we're going to use this money to solve some sort of social problem that the government is interested in. Something like housing homeless people, something like that. And so rather than giving the federal government giving the money directly to the agencies that are working in that space, there's a middle step that we can thank the Reagan administration for. It's called a block grant. And what they'll do is they'll just say, look, we're just going to give this money to the state, and we're going to let the state do all the work to figure out who's going to use that money to provide the service. So the state actually receives the grant from the federal government and then re-grants it out to agencies that do the work. And this is very common. One of the challenges is that because it's federal money, all of the federal requirements apply to it. So if the federal government says, and it's all in the Code of Federal Regulations, so it's 2 CFR 200, and there's this whole long section that just deals with all of the restrictions and things that you need to know when you're dealing with federal money in any capacity at all. If it's a grant that's been given to you in any capacity at all. And they're very specific, and they're pretty clear, to be honest. I mean, it's regulations, right? So don't read it unless you don't read it while you're operating a motor vehicle, right? It'll make you super sleepy, but it's it's actually very good. It's not terrible. It's not reading tax forms. It's easier than that, I think. But what happens a lot of times is because they are complicated, and to be honest, I mean, I think if you printed it out, it would be something like 700 pages. It's a really ridiculous length of how much stuff is in there. And the federal government is very clear about it, but then they pass it to a state. And depending on what state you're in, the state may have a really robust grant office or a really robust department that deals with these grants all the time, is really clear about how they work. Or it may be sort of underfunded, kind of half thought about, like, oh, look, we got this money. Can you figure out what to do with it? And so you've got folks in those roles that may not be 100% clear on what the requirements are. The problem then is that the state is the one that's re-granting it to the nonprofit organization. So if you're applying for federal money through a state agency, a lot of times, there's a high chance that there can be some confusion about what the federal rules are and what the state thinks the federal rules are. And some of the concepts are, I mean, to be honest, they're accounting concepts. So they're confusing to a lot of people. Like one of the things, like, what's the difference between a direct cost and an indirect cost? What's the difference between an allocated cost and a not allocated cost? Is there such a thing as an allocated direct cost, or is that not a thing? And all of a sudden, I mean, just the people listening to the podcast right now, half of you swerved off the road or in a ditch because that was so boring. Yeah. Right. So it becomes very, very complicated, and you need to have it like sort of explained to you by somebody that's really understands this well. So the question, finally get to after that 10-minute preamble.
Thank you for that background, though.
The question.
That helped me, Andy. So I'm sure it helped others if they're not snoozing on the side of the road. So
yeah, I'm sorry. We'll send an ambulance. The scenario in the question here is that there's a disconnect between what the federal government requires and what the state is telling you, and you're finding out about this disconnect at the application stage. So we see this a lot. So one of the things that you might see is the state will say salaries are not allowed. Like, we're not going to pay salaries on this grant, right? And then you look back at the federal grant, like what the federal grant is given to the state, and it's just a normal grant. They haven't said that there's no such thing as adding salaries. That's just that somebody at the state has decided to add this additional requirement. And so the calculus that you need to do internally is, do we push back on the state and say, you guys need to read this more carefully? Like, because based on my understanding of what this says, these should be allowable. Can you show me in the guidance where it says that that's not allowable? And that's kind of the answer. So unfortunately, there's no, I'm going to call my mom, right? You can't go to the federal government and say, can you slap down the state and tell them they're doing it wrong, unless they're really doing it wrong. Like, you can't go to the OMB and say, the Office of Management and Budget, and say, this state is applying new rules to the grant, unless they're really egregious and they break federal law. Things like the state says you only can serve white people, right? That would clearly be the opportunity to go back to every federal agency and say, can you deal with this for us, please? Because we can't. But if it's something like just a misread of a technical detail, like they said that this isn't allowable when it clearly is, then you just have to decide, like, how much can I push against the state agency Is it worth it to take a grant where I know I'm not going to be funded for everything I'm supposed to be funded for? How much time am I going to spend butting heads with this agency, which is then going to audit me at the end of it? The agency is responsible for doing a program audit back to you. So if you make them angry at the beginning of the process, they're going to stay angry when they come back. I'd say in my experience, it's about 50-50. So sometimes you'll look at it and you'll see that they're interpreting it wrong and you're like, it's not worth the squeeze. Like, we could go after this grant. Number one, it's a federal grant, so it's going to be complicated to begin with. The state's going to make it worse by telling us things that are not allowable. So we're basically leaving money on the table because we're going to have to spend it, but we can't actually apply it to the grant because they're reading it wrong. So let's not go after this federal grant. It's just too much of a drag. Other times where you get into it and you're like, okay, this is a lot of money. This is going to do a lot of good. Let's come up with a comprehensive way to be able to talk to the state to get them to be more cool with it. So what I usually lead with when I have to do this kind of thing is I lead with something like, I'm sorry, I'm having trouble understanding where this requirement came from. Based on my reading of the guidance, and you'd say 2 CFR 200.520, it says that I have to expense the value of the food based on when it's been distributed, even though it hasn't been distributed yet. That's what this guidance says, or my interpretation of the guidance is this. But in your grant, you're telling us something different. You're telling us that we need to expense it as we receive it, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense based on the way I'm reading it. Could you help me understand this, right? And as long as you're going into it, I mean, this is very hard for me.
I was going to say,
it's very hard for me.
I want to give you props, though. I'm very impressed because when you were saying that was exactly what has been on my mind. Is there a way to approach this to not put somebody on the defensive, but instead to actually ask the question like you're asking instead of telling them they're idiots? And this is not, it's a mismatch. Yeah.
Think of it, if you think back to like a high school math test where the teachers returned the test to you and you think it's still right, but you got it marked wrong.
Yeah.
Like, what outcome do you want? Like, do you want to make the teacher mad or do you want the point back? Is there a way to get both of those, get one without the other?
Right.
Like, how possible is that? Right. And the way to do it, I think in this case, and the way to do it, especially if you can tell in the guidance that you see it this way and they're interpreting it the wrong way. If you send that along with your request, because a lot of times you're going to be talking to somebody who isn't an authority on the guidance. Like, they're just trying to do their job. And somebody said, oh, you can't do salaries. And they're like, okay, I'm putting in, you can't do salaries. Right. And so when you come back with, well, it says here that salaries are totally allowed. Can you show me where I might be missing something? Right. They may go back. I mean, they could dig in their heels and go, go pound sand, or they could come back and say after 3 weeks, because they've had to run it up the chain to 11 different people. And then finally come back with, oh, you're right, salaries are allowed, right? In which case you didn't make anybody mad, and you probably got what you want. But I think you just kind of have to do the math in your head to determine, is it worth the squeeze?
I think that's great advice. I also think I heard you say your approach and how you frame it is important. But the other big part of that I heard you say is make it as easy as possible for the person that you're reaching out to, because by saying to them, here's this specific section I'm referring to, here's this where it conflicts, you aren't making them do a ton of legwork, and that is probably going to help in your favor because they're not going to have to go figure out exactly what part of the regs or whatever you said, right?
Yeah. And I mean, it just maybe show if you're like me and you have a hard time with English sentences that don't sound angry, like maybe show it to somebody else and say, does it sound like I'm yelling at them? Because I really don't want to sound like I'm yelling at them.
Yeah. And I guess, I wonder, Andy, and is the person that they usually put as your point of contact for questions in a position to make a difference in this? Because I could see where it could be very easy, depending on the sort of level of authority the person has that you reach out to. It could be easy for them to just be like, oh gosh, I just want to tell them it is what it is because I don't want the headache of having to go through 3 higher ups to get this figured out. Have you found it's a certain person with a certain type of authority that is generally put in this position, or is it more of kind of an entry level person?
No, sometimes it's the director of the department.
Okay.
But you're right. They just don't understand it. Again, because it's really complicated. It's not an easy thing to understand. And you have to do a lot of work to understand it to begin with. And these people are doing a whole lot of other things. This isn't the only job that they're doing. Yeah. And the question didn't ask it, but sort of the corollary is, how do you handle this after you've received the grant and you're already submitting your first reimbursement request? And they deny your first reimbursement request by telling you, oh, you can't apply indirect to this grant, right? Or something just absurd like that. And again, it's just the polite pushback based on my reading of, because part of it is that because the federal government, this is the good part, because the federal government is so specific, like there's almost no gray area where somebody can make an interpretation. Like any question you have, you'll be able to get an answer based on a reading of the regulations. So by providing the regulations back, sometimes it's very clear, like, you don't know what you're talking about. Can you fix this, please? And it's just a matter of, getting somebody who's overworked, underpaid, has to live in some terrible town because that's where the capital is, right? Digging their heels in just because they're in a bad mood, right? So that's what you want to avoid.
Our board has asked us to get 3 bids on outsourced services like HR, strategic planning, public relations, and so on. What do you recommend for evaluating these proposals when the service being provided is outside of our expertise? How do we ensure we're not comparing apples and oranges? And how do we know which is the best proposal for our agency?
It's a trap.
It's a trap.
It's absolutely a trap. So I know they're required. I know people's purchasing policies a lot of times require that you get bids from people. Unfortunately, it's coming from a good place. It's coming from the board wants to make sure that you're not overpaying for services, that you're really carefully thinking about the people that we're going to work with. There's all these good reasons to get multiple bids. What they don't realize is that in order to successfully evaluate the bids, it's a ton of work. So to do this right, and it's going to be really disappointing too. And I've got a personal story that I think is one of my finer moments. What you should, the right way to do it is to create an RFP. So not just get bids, you have to create an RFP, which is something that someone's going to respond to. So first, you have to sit down and have to think of all of the things that you want from the service, all the questions you're going to ask, and then you have to come up with a scoring rubric, which is going to be a sheet of paper that says, for this particular question, what would you score them from 1 to 5, and what are the criteria for scoring 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for each one of the things? It's almost like you're getting to be a grant reviewer for a grant that you're sending to somebody else, right? Where you want to be here are the things that I'm looking for this particular opportunity. Here's how I'm going to score them. And then we're going to pick the one with the highest score. So here's the problem with that is that's a ton of work, especially for something that you don't really know about already. So you're going to have to ask for help. You're going to have to find somebody, ideally, potentially somebody on your board who's an HR person, to say, can you help me design a rubric? Now that you've given me these really complicated tasks, I'm going to turn it back on you and say, now you're part of the committee that's going to design the rubric and design the RFP to reach out to the HR company to be able to score all those questions so that we can see who's going to give us the services based on who wins the rubric, right? The second problem that comes up is that nobody's going to respond to the RFP correctly. You're going to say, I need you to answer these questions. I need you to do them in this format. And this is where you can sort of feel the pain of a grant reviewer too, right? Feel like you're the grant reviewer when somebody sends in a grant and they're like, they didn't answer the questions. I have to score you a 1 because I asked you this question and you answered something else. So you got a 1, right? So you get to be, maybe you can think of it that way. It's something fun to do where you're torturing someone else for a change. But what's going to happen is you're going to get all these responses from the RFPs, and they're all going to be wrong, and you're going to end up with a whole bunch of incomplete information. At the end of it, you're going to have to make a gut call. So this is my story. working with a really big organization, had the opportunity to get a significant dollar amount for an endowment. So somebody was going to give us some endowment money, and we needed to come up with an investment. We needed to pick an investment company to help us manage this money. And so I did tons of research on like, what's the best RFP for finding an investment company for a nonprofit? Like looked at a whole bunch of research, read a couple of books on it, like tried to get myself as skilled up on this as I possibly could. Wrote a really good RFP, wrote a really good scoring rubric, and 0 out of the 6 people that we sent it to actually followed the instructions. Oh. So I had all of this work that I'd done to put this whole thing at the end of it, like nobody had followed any of the instructions. And so it ended up being, and we had a board committee that was part of it too. And it ended up that everybody just kind of picked the one that they felt seemed right, which was so completely defeated the purpose of doing an RFP and a rubric to begin with. Like, so everybody just kind of had their gut feeling. And as part of the committee, I knew I had to deal with it. I had a gut feeling too. We ended up picking somebody. And because the committee also had bankers on it who felt like the company that they were connected to, like should have got the work, even though they all did a terrible job at filling out the RFP. There was blowback to the board chair, which turned into the board chair like yelling at me over lunch about how dare I do that? Oh. Like never do that again, right? So I still think, I mean, if I had the opportunity to do it again, would I do things differently? Absolutely. Do I think that I deserve to get yelled at by the board chair? No, probably not. We're still friends, but it was one of my more unpleasant things in nonprofit service that I remember. And it's specifically because like we were trying to do it right. We were trying to, like, the board gave us instructions. You have to do it this way. Nobody's going to help me. So we have to do it right. And we ended up with just like a big mess that made me uncomfortable at the end.
Question.
And the people we ended up picking were like, okay. I mean, they were fine, but.
Was there a conflict of interest, like policy put into place for those committee members?
Yeah, we had one.
Okay.
We managed it too. So we had people come in and do presentations, and the person that was they got to sit in on the presentation, but they weren't allowed to vote for their own person.
Okay.
Which, I mean, and part of it was difficult too, because you wanted people that had some expertise in the area to be able to make the determination. You wanted them to be able to ask intelligent questions. So it's not like we could kick them all out and bring in a bunch of like randos to just say like, help us pick this, which probably, maybe that would have been the smarter way to do it. I don't know. Left a really bad taste in my mouth, which is why when I see our board wants us to get 3 bids on outsourced services, I'm like, make them do it. Like, say, great, I would be delighted for your help in designing all these things, and you can help me pick them. And I'm not going to have an opinion because inevitably I'm going to get yelled at by the board chair, whatever happens.
Yeah. Good cautionary tale. I also think one of the ways you could get people. So I've seen groups do this, and they actually don't allow anyone who's on the committee to have submitted, even if they have the expertise. Or like the agreement is you can't submit a bid and serve on the committee, because you're still getting you're getting information about your competitors and how they bid it. There's some things that, even though it may not jeopardize the organization, it kind of gives that person this weird unfair advantage for going back and knowing how to price things or bid things for themselves. So I've seen a lot of groups kind of draw a hard and fast line with that. I've seen some groups actually bring in, and I kind of like this idea, if you can find any people, nonprofit peers that, so you mentioned like PR. So as an example, if you had nonprofit peers that had a larger staff than you and had some PR expertise, they might be great, right? Like to bring in, because they're not looking for the work. So I think there's ways you can find it. I think that it definitely references. I mean, obviously you're going to get the references that they want you to talk to. And we know that right. Sometimes you'd be surprised at, when you call those references, what they say. And sometimes you find out informally from someone else that worked with that group, and you can kind of do a sidebar and say, hey, just curious. So I think there's ways to sort of also kind of get the real scoop. But overall, one other thing I'd say, even if you don't have expertise, you know what the goals hopefully are of your organization and where you're trying to go. So, hey, we want to increase our reach on social media and engagement, and this is what, but we're looking to do that because this is what we're trying to achieve with that. So like even sharing that in the RFP, I think is helpful. What I find, because I've been on both ends of this, right? The review committee reviewing, the proposals that come through the request for proposal system. But I've also been on the other end where I've been the one responding to an RFP. And it's really tough if I don't have some context of what is it that you're looking to accomplish by engaging in this. And it may seem straightforward, but I still want to hear it because, Andy, you and I have talked about this. How many times have I gotten a strategic planning RFP that when if I'm allowed to ask a question about it, I find out that that's actually not at all what they need. And they're actually really looking for something different, but they're calling it strategic planning, right? So like,
right.
I also think really being crystal clear on your goals and articulating those will help just clarify and get you people who understand, that respond to it, understand where you're trying to go and how best to get you there. You survived another episode of Nonprofit Everything. Andy and I love that you join us. We appreciate your loyalty, and we hope you got a nugget or two out of it. We certainly, can get off on tangents and talk about things that aren't even the questions we get asked. And that's part of the fun of it. We hope you enjoy that stream of consciousness with us too. And if you like this, we hope you'll share this with friend, colleague, someone else in the nonprofit sector that you think would benefit, because that's how we get to spread the nonprofit magic. And with that, thank you for what you do. Always have to say a big hats off from the bottom of our hearts. We know that you work hard, and we know that time is short. So you taking the time to listen to us means the world. So thank you so much. Until next time.